What makes January 6th something that was able to be used as an insurrection and this big narrative was the fact that people got into the Capitol. And the question has to be asked, why would it be that so many professional law enforcement, Secret Service people, etc., military people allowed things to get out of hand? Why wasn't there adequate security? Why on the day of January 6th wasn't there more of a sense of urgency to prevent people from being able to get into the Capitol? My conclusion to this is the most likely scenario is we see what happened. There was motivation from establishment people in the Democratic Party and in agencies like the FBI that were able to then smear a group that they didn't like, MAGA and Trump, and were able to use that to institute all sorts of things that were beneficial to them after January 6th, such as the Biden administration being able to expedite their agenda by censoring people that were from MAGA and treating the opposition like they're domestic terrorists, and basically putting a pin in any criticisms of the 2020 election by giving an excuse to censor this information online and other places. The FBI has their largest task force in history, which is then allowing them to suggest that they need to have increased money, increased buildings, etc., to be able to build up their agency because it's so important that they go after these domestic terrorists. And so what I want to do is weigh that next to what the excuse from the official people defending January 6th as an insurrection will say, and they'll say all of the evidence that I'm about to outline to you is just evidence of incompetence. That's always what they do. Every time we see over and over and over, particularly the intel agencies that have engaged in corruption against Trump and people surrounding Trump, they'll just say every time it's incompetence, every time. So let's go through the top 6 actions, 3 before January 6th and 3 during January 6th, of the lack of law enforcement's urgency in stopping the riot that was January 6th. The first one would be the FBI withholding intelligence. Now, the FBI is claiming afterwards that they knew this was an insurrection, and so in trials of people like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, they're claiming that they had confidential human sources implanted into these organizations and knew through daily or weekly meetings that there was about to be an insurrection. And they had intelligence, for example, that said they were going to try to kill Mike Pence, or they were going to try to kill the Palace Guard, in other words, the United States Capitol Police. However, this intelligence was never shared. The bulk of it wasn't given, and we've seen both two people we'll mention here later, Capital City Police Steve Sund, who is the person who was most tasked, as always, with defending the Capitol. He claims that had he received this information, he would have had adequate security and things would have never got out of hand. And even the Sergeant at Arms under Nancy Pelosi, a man by the name of Paul Irving, claimed the same thing. So the question is, why was the FBI routinely on these meetings before January 6th with Stephen Sund and others, where Stephen Sund was saying, we don't have any specific intelligence that there's going to be any attack, and so we're going to have more of a lax security? Why did the FBI leaders that were on those meetings say, whoa, 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 no, actually, we do have very specific intelligence that there's about to be an insurrection? In fact, the FBI agent in charge was a man by the name of Steve D'Antoni. He was the guy who was in charge during the Gretchen Whitmer Fednapping hoax. In other words, he already showed once that the FBI was able to encourage something that would be seen as a very hostile act for what was tantamount to political points to paint MAGA people as bad. But trust him, he didn't do it this time. So the question remains, why didn't they share that intelligence? Next, General Milley. Now, you know General Milley as the general that hated Trump, that basically admitted he would commit treason, that he would contact China to warn them if Trump ever decided to have military action to them. That is a general of our military and the chief executive of the military, the president, going behind his back to aid a foreign country. That's what we know about Milley. Milley was doing all sorts of independent research on his own before January 6th, and he claims that he was able to find all sorts of evidence of talk of killing Congress people and an insurrection that was about to come. But instead of informing the people tasked with defending the Capitol that day, instead he just talked to Democratic senators about it. Why? Why would Milley, someone who's in the military, whose chief concern is protecting the United States, if he had credible information there was about to be an attack on the United States Capitol, why wouldn't he share it with the people that were tasked with defense? Why wouldn't he share that all throughout the military to make sure that the military knew the hostilities that were about to come so that they would be able to be preparing for contingency plans if things got worse? But yet instead, Milley only talked to Democratic senator. Pelosi Sergeant at Arms Paul Irving. Now, Captain Stephen Sund has testified that he went to Paul Irving, and because of the way the law was set up, even though the Capital City Police Chief, in this case Sund, was the person primarily tasked with defending the Capitol, the law says that before he requests the National Guard's aid, he has to go through this sort of panel, two of which the people on the panel would have been the Sergeant at Arms under Mitch McConnell and under Nancy Pelosi. So he can't legally make the request for the National Guard until he talks to the Sergeant at Arms. So he talked to the Sergeant at Arms, I believe on January 3rd, Paul Irving, who answers directly to Nancy Pelosi. And he said, can we have the National Guard? And Paul Irving said no, because of optics. In other words, they were afraid to have the National Guard there because they thought it would look like Trump, like having some sort of military coup. Therefore, they thought, it's okay. There won't be anything that gets out of hand. Then we saw that Sund went and talked to the Sergeant at Arms under McConnell. And that Sergeant at Arms, when he finally got in touch with him, basically said quickly, no, just talk to the DC National Guard. Months later, Stephen Sund said he would talk to that same Sergeant at Arms under McConnell and say, hey, why did you come up with that so fast instead of saying yes or no about the National Guard to call? And he said because the Sergeant at Arms under Nancy Pelosi, in this case Paul Irving, called Stenger, the one under McConnell, and said, hey, Capital City Police Chief Sund's about to ask you for the National Guard. Under no circumstance give it to him. Pelosi wouldn't allow it. That's what's been testified to under oath. And yet there has been no investigation into Nancy Pelosi. There's been no subpoenaing of her records. And there hasn't even been subpoenaing of Paul Irving's records to see if he indeed had conversations with Nancy Pelosi about this. Why would this guy and Nancy Pelosi not want the National Guard there to provide protection, particularly when we know that there was intelligence going around that there was about to be an insurrection? Now, the day of January 6th, forget what we just talked about. That was in preparation. Now let's talk about the actual day of January 6th. Around 12:57, the Capital City Police Chief, Stephen Sund, thinks that there's enough evidence that this is a violent action that's getting out of control that he starts to request the National Guard. So why was the National Guard so late in deploying that day? Remember, what separates January 6th from a day like May 30th, 2020? Well, what separates it is May 30th, where you actually had violent insurrectionists from the left that were using lethal weapons in the form of Molotov cocktails, burning down a guard station, attacking police, etc. They didn't get into the building because there was adequate security. You see this all the time. There was another pro-Hamas rally the other day where instead of having little bike racks, they had big fence and they had adequate security there. And so therefore people say, not a big deal. But if there wasn't security there and people would have rushed through to the White House, would we then be able to say this was a dangerous insurrection? We don't know, because for some reason, even though there was evidence that this day was going to be an insurrection, we're now being told, the FBI and these other agencies did less than usual. You would think if they thought the government was about to be overthrown, they would do more than usual, but instead they did less than usual. So once we get to the day of January 6th, once things start to become a riot, why is it that we're so late to deploy adequate police presence or National Guard presence to prevent people from getting into the Capitol? So let's go through some of it. First, that same guy, the Sergeant at Arms under Pelosi, Paul Irving, who already said that he didn't want the National Guard there for optics, who we now know said that Nancy Pelosi would not accept the National Guard under any circumstances. He gets a call at 12:57 from Sund and says, can you give me permission to request the guard? And remember, legally, Sund had to ask the Sergeant at Arms this question before he could request deployment. And basically, Irving said, let me get back to you. Sund called Irving 11 times. Irving said he had to kick it up the chain. The only person up the chain was Nancy Pelosi. That's the only person he answers to. 11 times he received a call before he finally gave permission around 2 o'clock, right around the time when people were breaching the Capitol. Now, my contention is that's what was wanted this day by all of these agencies. They wanted a breach of the Capitol so that they could use their insurrection narrative, which clearly we could see they've used that narrative to personal benefit. So right at that point, when people start to get close to the Capitol and start breaching, finally he says, okay. But here's the crazy part. Paul Irving lies under oath about it. He says he didn't receive a call until, I believe, around 2 o'clock. And the first time he got the call from Stephen Sund, he went ahead and gave permission. But Sund has the records of the calls that he makes and was in a room with a bunch of people that could back up his testimony that he called 11 times for 71 minutes. And yet, for some reason, the January 6th committee, that's allegedly about how do we make sure this thing doesn't happen again, they have no problem with this dispute and testimony between Sun and Irving. Seeing as how Sun has the documents and the call logs to back this up, it's evident that Irving's lying. So why did he not allow the National Guard? And then why did he lie about it later? If truly they believed this was an insurrection that was going to harm senators and possibly Mike Pence, why would they delay in getting the adequate security there? Next is Lieutenant General of the Army, Piatta, denies the National Guard for optics. And so we could see that after the request for permission was given, Sun then gets on a phone call with a bunch of leaders, including the DC Mayor Bowser, people from the Army, people from the CIA, and the person that speaks up is Lieutenant General Piatta. And he tells Sun that they're not going to allow the request for the National Guard because of optics. Now imagine being a senior member of the military, who one of your chief jobs is not just to protect this country, but to also protect the leaders of this country. And you think that there is an impending insurrection, that the hordes are at the gates. You see that they're breaking into the Capitol, and you fear for the lives of senators and for people like Mike Pence. And yet you say, I'm willing to risk those senators dying because optics. This makes no sense. And yet, Piatta hasn't received any discipline to my knowledge. There haven't been massive outcries by the people that are crying about January 6th, like Kissinger or Liz Cheney or any of the Democrats, demanding answers from Piatta why he would say, wait a minute, you allowed this insurrection to occur because of optics? And now we have the bombshell video that is released of the Secret Service and law enforcement and their reaction to the pipe bomb that was outside the DNC. You could see the video that Darren Beatty from Revolver News has put out that was released by Thomas Massey. It shows that a man in a hoodie that we now allegedly know to be an undercover or a plainclothes Capital City police officer nonchalantly walking up to Secret Service and law enforcement and telling them that he saw a pipe bomb. Then you see them standing around doing seemingly nothing while literally they allow children to walk across the street and get within 5 feet or so of this pipe bomb. Now imagine this. You think that this is an insurrection or at least a riot that's getting out of hand, and you're law enforcement, and you think that you see an active pipe bomb, and yet you just stand around and you allow people, civilians, innocent children, to get really close to the pipe bomb. You're not immediately segregating off the area. In fact, the Secret Service was there because Kamala Harris, the VP-elect, was there. They didn't have a sense of urgency, it seems, to protect her. Why? It's almost as if they're acting as if they know the pipe bomb is fake. But how would they know that? Even if they suspected, well, it's probably not real, average protocol would be that you treat any threat as legitimate. There is no excuse whatsoever for their nonchalant attitude, particularly when it comes to allowing civilians in the form of children to get near that pipe bomb. Why would they have this attitude? All of this combined shows one constant factor, that despite overwhelming evidence, there were seemingly inexplicable decisions made over and over and over that were not only against the norm, but were against the norm in making things as nonchalant as possible. We're not going to share intelligence. We're not going to rope off that section with the pipe bomb. We think that this is a violent insurrection to overthrow the government, but we're not going to deploy the National Guard. This is from multiple people, multiple groups. And what we're told to believe is it was just all incompetence. So at the same time that a lieutenant general of the government doesn't know that, if there's an impending insurrection, we should allow the National Guard, optics wouldn't be a concern, and that Paul Irving lied about 11 times that he received this call requesting it and for some reason didn't give permission to request the National Guard. And he said previously that he didn't want it before January 6th because it would be bad for optics and Nancy Pelosi would never allow it. All of these things combined, you have to ask yourself, what is the most likely explanation? It's not just as we hear from the establishment bootlickers over and over again. Each of these, just like the FISA warrants, the illegal spying on Trump, just like the not charging people in the Hillary case for intentionally destroying subpoenaed evidence, every single time that we see some sort of action being taken like this, it almost always seems to benefit these establishment groups and harm the groups connected to Trump. And every time when we see that there's problems, the explanation without fail is, it was just incompetence. These career level people at our intelligence services, at our law enforcement, at our military, over and over and over, seemingly, despite the fact that it's obvious that they're benefiting from this because they didn't like Trump. As Chuck Schumer said, they'd find 6 ways from Sunday at getting him, and it ends up benefiting them personally and with their agencies personally. We're told to say, forget all of that. Forget all of that. It's just incompetence. The last question that remains is this. Why didn't Democrats in the January 6th committee focus on these issues more? If they think this was truly an insurrection and we were a hair's breadth from an actual violent overthrow of this government, surely they would want answers for how it occurred in the first place. Let's take the latest issue, the January 6th pipe bomb. This footage has been available to the January 6th committee, and it's been drug out so that the average American people wouldn't be able to see it. Why? And if they did see it, surely they could come to the same conclusion that you will and any objective person would, which is, why are these law enforcement agencies standing around? Who was the plainclothes officer that reported it? Who were the officers that just stood there and allowed children to get remarkably close to the pipe bomb? Why aren't there answers for this? Not only for the American people, but for the people that were in this committee. Why does there seem to be almost no focus whatsoever on the pipe bomb? The clearest explanation is because these things actually benefited the Democratic Party and benefited these agencies. They don't want to talk about like, oh yeah, it looks really bad that we allowed all of this to occur. Instead, they want to say Trump's an insurrectionist, Trump people are insurrectionists. The most likely scenario, given all of this evidence, is that January 6th was something that was planned to get out of control by these agencies and the establishment so that they could use it as an excuse to finally bury MAGA. That's the truth that they don't want to talk about, and they don't have a better explanation. Instead, they'll scream, conspiracy theory, conspiracy theory. The real explanation is they're all grossly incompetent, but none of them really get punished. So I hope that you go and you watch that January 6th video of the pipe bomb that was just released, and I hope that you're able to make your own conclusion. Ask yourself this: why did they stand around, and why did all these actions outlined in this video occur?